Texas's Fortress on a Hill with Henry, Danny, Kagan, and Giovanni.
Here's part 2 of our discussion with Camilo Mejia. If you haven't heard part 1, definitely go back and listen to it, although it's not needed to understand part 2. Enjoy, folks.
And, for me, that really captures my experience. When I went to Iraq, I was questioning a lot of things, but I came from a Sandinista background, right? My parents are both Sandinistas fighting against this dictatorship that you talked about. The Somoza family. It was actually more than 40 years. It was most of the time it was the Somozas, but for very brief periods of time during more than 4 decades, it was Somoza puppets. And yeah, indeed, they were left behind by the U.S. When the U.S. left after that occupation that ended with Sandino, when Sandino, the liberal general, who went rogue, refused to put down his weapons, after a deal that was made, brokered by the U.S. between the liberals and the conservatives, and which is almost to say like the Democrats and the Republicans here. Right. But we could even go back further, because U.S. imperialism is Western imperialism. Right. So it's something that continues, from the colony. Before the U.S., in the North, it was the British crown, and here was the Spanish crown. We were basically subjects to the Spanish crown, much like people in the U.S., were subjects to the British crown. And what you have is a struggle of power that, on one hand, traditionally this has been the conservatives, right? But on one hand, represents, that crown power. It represents the extraction of goods and resources from the land, to be brought into the empire. And in the case of the U.S., that was the British crown. In the case of Latin America, that was the Spanish crown. And with the U.S. imperialism, once the U.S. kicks off Spain and says, America for Americans, it's basically just a change of management, right? But it's the same thing, right? It's the same stuff that happened all over the American continent. First with the British and the Spanish, and after that with the U.S. But what happened was that we had an oligarchy, which, unlike other oligarchies, or like the concept of oligarchy in a place like, for instance, Ukraine, or Russia, where an oligarch is someone who has X amount of money and access to media resources and things like that. In Nicaragua, these were the people left behind by the crown, the landowners, who viewed indigenous and poor people as an extension of their right and their land and their power, and when the Spanish left, they left behind these people, who had all the political power, all the social power, all the economic power, all the land. And, they never really had a vision of progress. They inherited that feudalist mentality. But alongside that, you had the merchants, you had the people who wanted to get into imports and exports. And they were not landowners, they were into commerce, and they wanted to bring people from the rural areas into the metropolis and develop roads and railroads and bridges. And they needed to build schools for the workers, the people who would come from the rural areas into the cities. And so they had a bit of a more progressive vision of what kind of nation they wanted to have. And so we had that in Nicaragua, and we had that all throughout Latin America, right? You had the oligarchy, which is like the all power, handed over by the Spaniards that left. And then you had the new power, the new money, the bourgeoisie. And so in Nicaragua, that has completely played out, to the T, basically, where you had these two forces that always were fighting. And the U.S. was basically the role that the U.S. played in Nicaragua historically has been to basically broker the peace between those two factions of political and economic power, so that whatever government is there basically oversees U.S. interests. And so within that power struggle, we had a bourgeois liberal nationalist, which was President Zelaya, who wanted to basically build schools and wanted people to be able to learn to read and write, wanted to build hospitals, and had a lot of progressive ideas. Was not like a revolutionary like Sandino was, because Sandino, he was the son of a rich landowner and a servant, a peasant woman, right? So he had a little bit of both. He had a little bit of like this oligarchic mentality. His dad was very progressive, and his brother ended up fighting with him. But like half of him was like this wealthy. He lived in poverty until he was like, I think, 11 years old or something like that. He was a bastard child, of course, but he had seen both of those. He had seen that extreme poverty, and he had seen wealth. And so for him, when Sandino comes into the picture, he basically disrupts that balance, between liberals and conservatives, between old money and new money, that at the end of the day did whatever the US told them to do. So Sandino brings in a very different kind of nationalism into the picture, because it's a popular nationalism. And so the revolution that we have with Sandino is not a bourgeois revolution like the revolutions that we had in the past, which were revolutions in which conservatives and liberals were fighting for power, and the US would come in and basically mediate a peace between them so that they could continue extracting the wealth. When Sandino comes into the picture, he comes in with ideas from the Mexican Revolution and communism and other things like that. And he obviously he comes from like this extremely poor background, where his mother was this peasant woman who had been highly exploited and kicked to the side, and his dad was this wealthy landowner. And so he comes in with a sort of like class analysis into the picture. And from that moment on, and we're talking about now 1927, when Sandino basically rejects this balance between liberals and conservatives. But from that moment on, the nationalist struggle of Sandinismo, and that's his birth. The people, the peasants, the indigenous people, people without shoes, people without education, people who were illiterate, become actors of change in Nicaragua. They become actors of revolution in Nicaragua. And so we have a dark period, which is when Sandino rebels against this pact, between liberals and conservatives, and he takes up arms against the US and beats the US. And this is one of the very few military defeats of the United States, back in the 20th century. And Marines actually learned guerrilla tactics from pursuing Sandino through the mountains of, northern Nicaragua. We were actually the first site of aerial bombardment, which is basically when the US was going after Sandino. They had planes, they had, warships, they had artillery, they had entire Marine units go after Sandino, and they could never catch him because the people that followed him were peasants. There were people from the mountains, there were people who knew the area well. In fact, they were people who worked at mines, they were miners. And so they would use dynamite, and they knew how to use dynamite, to work with, the natural environment. And they were able to evade capture and to score a lot of big wins to the point that the Marines left Nicaragua. And it was only through treason that they were able to get Sandino. They leave behind a contingency of US trained National Guardsmen. And they put this man in charge. His name is General Somoza. And Somoza signs a peace deal with Sandino, and then he assassinates him. And when he assassinates Sandino, that's basically the end of that movement, for between, I want to say 1934, I want to say for maybe 22 years, 23 years, something like that, when the Somoza patriarch gets basically assassinated by this patriot known as Rigoberto Lopez Perez. And then Rigoberto Lopez Perez basically inspires the Sandinista movement. A few years later, in 1961, the Sandinista Front of National Liberation is founded. and it's basically very much defined as a popular revolutionary movement, nationalist against U.S. imperialism, proxy U.S. imperialism, because of course we had this family that was a Nicaraguan family, a military dynasty, the Somozas, that were there basically, safeguarding U.S. interests. And this Somoza family, that was a military family, their roots are in the liberal movement, but they were dictators, and they didn't really care much for this balance between liberals and conservatives. So that means that the bourgeoisie and the oligarchy in Nicaragua did not like Somoza either, because he only represented U.S. interest in Nicaragua. And so that's one thing that worked against him, was that, the Sandinistas were able to tap into that resentment, in all sectors of Nicaraguan society, to lead a popular revolutionary movement to overthrow the U.S. proxy dictator, which was this family, the Somoza family, that had basically three presidents, the father and then two of his kids. And then in 1979, we win, we overthrow the dictatorship, and, pretty soon we have elections, we win overwhelmingly. And for the next 10 years, the revolution is basically besieged by a number of tactics, employed by the U.S. You guys probably know about the Iran-Contra affair, and other schemes, that the U.S. Cooked up to sustain the Contras, that were sabotaging and terrorizing the population. There was an embargo. There were terrorist acts that led to a trial at The Hague, that Nicaragua won again, and the U.S. was fined, I believe, $17 billion in damages for acts of terrorism against the Nicaraguan government and people. But it was really difficult to keep the people aligned with the revolution, even though, like, I want to believe, and I think that there's a lot of evidence to the fact that the people were with the Sandinista movement, with the Sandinista government, but we had lost in total more than 50,000 people to the war. We were in really bad shape. Our infrastructure was crumbling. We were embargoed. So our economy was in really bad shape, and people didn't want their sons and daughters to get killed anymore. They didn't want any more people to suffer from the war. And so we lost the elections in 1990. And from 1990 until 2006, we had a succession of governments back to the old dynamic of liberal versus conservative. And, we had governments that were, a little bit of both. They had maybe a liberal president, with like conservative ministers. And to them, it was always a power dynamic, like if they can keep the power balance, they're okay. But eventually, they always go back to fighting, and, they were fighting amongst them. And the Sandinista movement was able to take advantage of that. And because of the fracture within the oligarchy and the liberals and the conservatives, we were able to win back power with a majority of the vote that was bigger than the majority that they had together. So I believe we won the election with 35%. They had more than 35% together, but because of the fracture, we were able to win back the presidency. And we started implementing a lot of changes that we had already implemented from the beginning, with the help of President Chavez at the time. President Chavez came to Nicaragua to offer ALBA funds to the conservative president. The conservative president had, I believe, already signed CAFTA-DR, which is the neoliberal treaty in Central America and the Dominican Republic. And so the president said no to Chavez, like we've been neoliberalized and we don't want anything to do with you or your petroleum money or anything like that. So Chavez turned to the Sandinista movement, and the Sandinistas said,
And just to point out, Chavez, you're talking about Hugo Chavez from Venezuela.
President Hugo Chavez, yeah. And so the Sandinistas took the funds, from the Venezuelan government and started to implement anti-poverty measures, even not being in the presidency. And so what you start to see is an anti-poverty movement that's focusing on hunger and malnutrition and housing and things like that. That, of course, under neoliberal governments, both liberal and conservative, we had mortality rates that were through the roof. We had crumbling infrastructure. We had no access to healthcare, no access to education. The country was in really, really bad shape. So this injection of funds into the Sandinista front allows the Sandinista movement to start implementing a lot of these programs. And so by the time we win the presidency, we already have a lot of support, popular support, because we were meeting a lot of the basic needs that have been neglected by the neoliberal governments. And since 2007 until now, I do believe you have some figures, but we have been able to reduce dramatically infant mortality, maternal mortality. We're up to, I believe, 100% and electric coverage, in the entire country. I believe about 65% is renewable, clean energy. I believe about 35% of the land is in the hands of original peoples. We are like the 5th country in terms of gender equality because of the representation of women in different sectors of the economy and the government. I mean, I could keep going, but the changes that have been effected, which are continuation of the first period, are transcendental. The power, institutional power, beginning with the security apparatus, is in the hands of the people. And that's one thing that sets apart Nicaragua, Cuba, and Venezuela from other, progressive or pseudo-progressive governments in Latin America, is that we were able to overthrow a US-supported dictatorship, via an armed revolution. And that gave us the ability to build the society from the ground up, along with all its institutions. So we have a popular police, we have a popular military, we have, we have a ministry of women, that helps women and families. We have anti-poverty measures, education. We have universal health care. We're the 2nd poorest nation in the hemisphere, and we have universal health care. So it's like we represent an existential threat to US power, because if you are just a little bit richer than Nicaragua, which is 98% of the hemisphere, and you see that this poor nation is able to educate all its citizens, to eradicate illiteracy, to provide 100% electricity to all its citizens, to build new hospitals, to rebuild infrastructure, to have amazing roads and all these things. If you invest in people, if you invest in the public sector, and you reject neoliberal policies that basically extract your wealth, to sell you back products, after they've been manufactured in the, industrialized North, that there's a lot that you can accomplish, right? And so simply by being sovereign and looking after the interests of your people, you are able to accomplish so much. So because of that, I think that we remain in the sights of the US. But also one thing that I didn't mention, and that adds to your analysis of the United Fruit Company and US corporate interests along this whole, banana republic period, is that Nicaragua has a river that connects to a great lake, and it's basically a naturally made canal between the Caribbean and the Pacific. And the US has always viewed Nicaragua as a strategic point, first, to build a canal, and then once they build the canal in Panama, to prevent from other powers to come into Nicaragua and build a canal that would rival the Panama Canal. And right now we have China basically wanting to build a canal in Nicaragua. And of course, that's a major geostrategic interest, that, historic geostrategic interest that the US has had in Nicaragua, and why they have been so harsh with what happens in Nicaragua, is that, we have this not naturally made resource that creates a lot of interest in our geography. But yeah, so that, with all that said, I think that the good example that Nicaragua provided, became something that the U.S. no longer could tolerate. And so in 2018, we were basically targeted by this hybrid war that you and I have been studying a great deal.
Let me interject real quick here.
Right.
Hybrid war, just so people know what that means. Hybrid war is not just war with bombs and bullets, right? So I'm gonna read the definition from Wikipedia, right? Hybrid warfare is a theory of military strategy first proposed by Frank Hoffman, which employs political warfare and blends conventional warfare, irregular warfare, and cyber warfare with other influencing methods such as fake news, diplomacy, lawfare, foreign electoral intervention. By combining kinetic operations with subversive efforts, the aggressor intends to avoid attribution and or retribution. The concept of hybrid warfare has been characterized by a number of academics and practitioners due to its alleged vagueness, its disputed consecutive elements, and its alleged historical distortions. So it's a type of warfare that combines different types of methods, just like the Wikipedia definition gives it, right? It combines, irregular forces, by way of, like Nicaragua suffered in the 80s with the Contras, which was an overt military insurgency, actually, operating from the countryside, and they were being assisted by neighboring countries like Costa Rica and Honduras, Panama, and it also involves, just chaos in the streets, just so quote unquote spontaneous uprisings and whatnot, just like an experience in 2018 when you have actually laid the conditions, you have paid agitators, paid instigators in the streets, and try to bring chaos in the streets. You have you support local unrest, information warfare, propaganda, diplomacy, something about lawfare, hybrid lawfare, what do you call it, lawfare, which is the use of legal instruments. When you're targeting a particular individual, you use those different legal instruments pretty much to give it the approval of legitimacy. When in fact is you manipulate, you're weaponizing the legal system. That's pretty much what it is. And you have economic warfare, which before 2018, Nicaragua was under sanctions. They were under extreme sanctions during the 80s. They were under sanctions again when Daniel Ortega was elected in 2007. 2007, 27. And then the sanctions were increased after the 2018 period. The street protests that Camilo is going to go into right now. Was I accurate with that, Camilo?
Yeah, I mean, there's so much to say, but yeah, you captured it. And I think that going back to what I was saying about getting to power through an armed revolution, makes a huge difference because it's lawfare. Imagine if for some reason, like a populist in the US is able to win the election, which is like something, in my opinion, it's like anything that's outside of the Republican and the Democratic Party right now, it would be pretty much impossible because of all the laws that they have in place. But imagine if somebody wins the election in the US, what the hell are they going to be able to do? Absolutely nothing, because the institutional power is in the hands of the two parties, right? And the media is in the hands of the two parties, particularly the Democrats. The courts are in the hands of the two parties. The judicial, the legislative, the media, all the industries that pull the strings, military industrial complex, the entire nonprofit industry, Hollywood, everything, right? And so lawfare basically speaks to that you get a populace, that wants to implement laws that are for the benefit of the people. You cook up some corruption charges and you'll get rid of them, like they did to Dilma in Brazil, or, I think that with Zelaya, it was a little bit different because they criticized some of these political reforms that he intended to do, but in the end, it ended up being a military coup because they used the military to get him out. But by and large, this lawfare refers to the fact that this old guard, whether it's the bourgeoisie or the oligarchs, they are in power institutionally, militarily, economically. In Nicaragua, that's not the case. In Nicaragua, we have popular-led institutions, police, military, judicial, electoral council. So yeah, indeed. So in 2018, basically, one thing that
I'm sorry, let me add up that lawfare also with this happened here as well in the United States. I can think about FDR. FDR was considered a popular president. He was popular across the stream, across the working class Americans. And because he was popular, there were conspiracies against him by the mechanisms that you talked about. Most Americans don't know, or most Americans might not know that this constraint of 2 consecutive of term limits on a president's right didn't exist prior to FDR. It was put in place because of FDR, because FDR won 4 consecutive elections because he was so popular amongst the average Americans, right? But because he was popular amongst average Americans, once he passed, right, they created this mechanism of 2 terms because they're trying to, because this mechanism, the people who pull the strings are trying to avoid another FDR to come to power in the United States.
Yeah, it's exactly. Yeah. And it has to do with the fact that you can't dismantle status quo in 1 or 2 terms. It requires more than you have a long-term vision that you need to rehold the entire system, economic, political, social, financial. There's no way you can do it in 2 terms. So even if a president is incredibly popular and has a lot of people support, for any president to be able to dismantle the system, it would take a lot more than 2 terms. And so I think that's one of the reasons why people like Putin, is still in power, or like people like Merkel. Nobody talks about Merkel being in power since the year 2000 until, just a few weeks ago. But yeah, so in 2018, one of the dead giveaways also is that usually the IMF is in the background, right? There's usually some kind of deal or some kind of reform, that has to do with, liberalizing the economy, or, signing some kind of deal or some kind of bailout. I think in the Ukraine, there was the association deal with the European Union that would impose a lot of austerity measures, but of course, Ukrainians would get to travel through the European Union without any restrictions and be able to work and whatnot. And so they turned it into this like West versus East, struggle. But behind it was a deal, with the IMF. And if you look at a lot of the stuff that's happening right now, where there are a lot of uprisings, in response to neoliberal policies, usually you'll see the IMF or the World Bank or some kind of European Union financial institution behind, trying to implement changes, that affect working and middle class people by and large.
And NGOs, don't forget about NGOs, right? NGOs that you'll think that they're, like the National Endowment for Democracy and the USAID, different organizations. The what do you call the other one?
The International Republican Institute, Voice of America, National Democratic Institute,
Open Society is another one. So these NGOs as well, they interject because they're not connected to the state per se. They come in as people to people type of initiative, and they come into your country and they do this type of what we call democracy promotion, etc. They might come in and do some type of work in your country, establish some type of infrastructure, media. But at the end of the day, a lot of time, what they're an extension to the state where they come from. Particularly the Western states, and one of the things that was happening in Nicaragua, for example, when they target the youth a lot of the youth, and they do these workshops, it's media workshops, and they do these workshops in what they call democracy. A lot of these democracy promotion workshops that has to do with teaching people, particularly young people, how to, to protest, how to, and how to do these different type of, what are called nonviolent actions, where they actually use these uh, this actions where they do invite out violence and whatnot. You saw that in different countries. You saw that in Maidan. You saw that in Caracas. You see that recently in July 11th in Cuba. What they do is right. It's called marginal violence. Marginal something of violence, and it was created. And what it is put so much stress to the security forces where they actually they respond. And once they respond, then you catch it in the camera, then you proliferate all the images and stuff like that, and you create this state of anxiety and panic and warfare in a country, right? Where you're actually promoting instead of what they call quote unquote democracy, and you actually promoting the overthrow of the current government to conform to whatever agenda you bring into the intentions that you have.
Yeah, it's very insidious, and it's very it's very deceitful. A lot of it you can read on Gene Sharp's manual, From Dictatorship to Democracy. I think that he describes about 198 tactics, nonviolent tactics that are basically used alongside selective use of violence, and an entire apparatus of propaganda that is made up not only of social media, but also traditional media, global reach media, and global reach human rights organizations, like the UN, the OAS, Human Rights Watch, Amnesty, and whatnot. And so what happened in Nicaragua was that they were going after retirement laws, and the IMF was basically telling the government that you need to increase the amount of years that people have to pay into the system to be able to qualify for retirement, and you need to kick out all these people who didn't pay enough, and that you gave like an emergency retirement because they were older and they never partook in the traditional economy. And so they were older and very poor, and they didn't have any retirement. So the government gave them a limited retirement, and the IMF said you need to do away with all that stuff. You can't give away anything. People have to pay double the amount of time, and you can give that much healthcare as well. And so they try to implement a lot of measures, that would really hurt people, especially really, really poor people. And the government said, no, we're not going to do that. What we're going to do is we're going to increase a little bit the amount of money that working people are going to pay into the system so that we can close the gap, the deficit. And we're going to take 5% from the cash benefit from retirees, and we're going to put that into the healthcare benefit. So it was a transfer of 5% and an increment of like maybe 1.25%. And the way that they framed it was that the government was cutting retirement, that they were basically targeting old people, old poor people. They didn't talk about the other part of the deal, which was, kick all these people out and like increase the amount of payments that people have to make. And, they just basically selectively took one part of it and then turned it into this horrible news that the government was, in an effort to make up for its corruption, was basically targeting poor old people. And so there were rallies, against the government. And what happens oftentimes with these color revolutions is that there's some kind of legitimacy to it, right? Like there's some kind of issue going on that they use in order to get people to come out. And then once people come out, there's violence, and there's a lot of confusion, right? There's snipers, there's beatings, and there is always a lot of out of context capture of specific moments, footage or pictures, where you have basically, for instance, you may have snipers shooting at cops. And then when cops realize that they're being shot at with real bullets, they shoot back. And so you already have people there on the scene ready to capture that and say, look, they're using deadly fire against people. And then before you know it, they already have like thousands of bots ready to like bombard people with messages and images and memes and things like that. And then before you know it, the entire machinery of US finance and trained nonprofits and human rights groups and media, traditional media and social media groups, there's like this coordinated, highly coordinated explosion of news basically portraying the government as criminal, like they're going out there, they're killing innocent civilians, they're killing students and whatnot. And then before you know it, Amnesty is involved, the UN is involved, the entire, global machine of regime change is involved. And it's actually, in order for them to do that, because this is usually done in a place where the government that's in power has implemented measures that are contrary to the IMF reforms, World Bank, neoliberal deals, and things like that, right? And so there isn't really a whole lot of opposition, like popular opposition to the government. The opposition is basically it sprouts out of the manipulation of the news and like the rallies and like the selective use of violence. But by and large, when you look at what's been going on in the country long term, you don't really see a history of oppression, you don't see a history of violence, and what you see is universal healthcare. What you see is housing programs. You see lowering mortality rates, whether you're talking about Cuba or you're talking about Venezuela or you're talking about Nicaragua or Bolivia, all these horrible dictatorships all offer universal healthcare. They all offer housing and all these things.
We get asked often what people can do to help support the podcast. One really powerful way to help us grow and reach more people is to leave us a review. You can do that on iTunes, which is the best place to leave a review. iTunes does reach the most people these days. The next best place is Facebook. Go to our Fortress on a Hill Facebook page and look for the Reviews tab. Money is tight these days for everyone, especially in the lingering shadow of COVID. Penny pinching to make it through the month often doesn't give people the funds to contribute to a creator they support. So we consider it the highest honor that folks help us fund the podcast in any dollar amount they're able. Patreons is the main place to do that, and for supporters who can donate $10 a month or more, they will be listed right here as an honorary producer, like these fine folks: Fahim Shirazi, James O'Barr, James Higgins, Eric Phillips, Paul Appel, Julie Dupree, Thomas Benson, Janet Hansen, Tristan Oliver, Daniel Fleming, Michael Karen, Zach H., Ren Jacob, Howard Reynolds, Rick Coffey, and the Status Quo podcast. Your contributions are wonderfully helpful to us. Thank you so very much. However, if Patreon isn't your style, you can contribute directly to us through PayPal at paypal.me/Fortress on a Hill. Or please check out our store on Spreadshirt for some great Fortress merch. And now, let's get back to the podcast.
The most wealthiest country in the hemisphere, if not the world, with a bigger population. That doesn't really make sense. And also, I'm looking at the expenditure of Nicaragua, being a country considered the poorest country in the world, country that's been in war, since the 80s. Actually, they haven't really recovered from the 80s. However, they're able to spend 8.4% of their budget on medical expenditure, right? And compare that to Dominican Republic, for example, which one kind of like I said, one of my countries of origin, which with a population of 10 million people, and a much wealthier country than Nicaragua, right? Their expenditure is 5.9% of the population. Now, the Dominican Republic is considered it's a close ally to the United States. It's considered a flagrant democracy, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Whereas Nicaragua is this horrible dictatorship. However, right, they spend more money on healthcare than the than its Democratic counterpart, the Dominican Republic. I'm looking at the other one. El Salvador spends about 7% of their budget on healthcare. Honduras, 7% of the budget on healthcare. Guatemala has a population of 17 million people. It only spends 6% of the budget on healthcare, whereas Nicaragua, a poor country, spends 8.4% of their healthcare, of their budget on healthcare. I just want to throw in some numbers there for you. Yeah.
Yeah, right. And so it's, you can imagine how difficult it would be to turn the population against a government like that. And so what the US has to do is they have to resort to real nasty elements within the society. And this is also something that you see in other applications of regime change, you know, whether you call it revolution or soft coup or whatever. But in Nicaragua, they used gang members and, you know, petty criminals, drug addicts, and they even imported some of the Maras, you know, which were like this US deported gang members, you know, young gangsters, you know, that were mostly from LA, I want to say, from California, that ended up in El Salvador and Honduras, and, you know, to a lesser degree in Guatemala. And so they brought a lot of those people to Nicaragua to basically run these things called tranques, which are basically barricades, and it's how they hope to stop the economy in order to put pressure on the people. And they were incredibly violent, and, you know, they would kill people, kidnap people, they would set people on fire. All that stuff is recorded. Of course, the media won't pick it up, right? Like the CNN won't pick it up, Amnesty International won't pick it up, Human Rights Watch won't pick it up. But it's basically what the people of Nicaragua were going through. If you look at the Ukraine, what they use there is neo-Nazis, right? Because by and large, even the people who were pissed with Yanukovych, because of all the corruption and all of that, like I said, you know, there's usually some degree of truth in all of this color revolutions. And so there was some degree of, you know, truth in people going out there because it was this reform and they were cutting the benefits of retirees and whatnot. But by and large, the people did not want to overthrow the government. And so they had to use these nasty elements of society and even import some help from the outside to overthrow the government, or to try to overthrow the government. It's the same thing that they did in Ukraine with neo-Nazis. In Venezuela, they use guarimberos, you know, very highly violent, you know, gang members and, you know, organized crime. In Syria, they use ISIS, you know, and, you know, all these moderate rebels that they call, they're not moderate at all. You know, they're nasty people. In Libya had the highest standard of any African country. They used people from the awakening councils in Iraq. You know, a lot of the people that were paid to stop fighting the US, you know, ended up in these awakening councils. They were the origin of ISIS and ISIL and all these groups. They ended up fighting against Gaddafi in Libya. And so, like, every time that you have a popular government, you know, that's both populist and popular because of all these laws and these transformative changes that they have undergone, you need to bring in these nasty elements, either, you know, fringe elements within the society that don't really have a whole lot of power politically or economically or, you know, militarily, and then they get, you know, financed and trained by the US. And so in Nicaragua, it was this, you know, people from the Maras, you know, in El Salvador and Honduras, and some people, you know, very poor people, drug addicts and gang members that were basically running this highly, you know, horrific, you know, scare campaign to basically turn the people against the government. They were not able to do it. You know, the Sandinista militancy came out and was able to dismantle. A lot of people saw what was really going on. You know, people who fell prey to a lot of the media efforts, you know, to portray the government as criminal. And so we were able to beat it. And of course, you know, after that, you know, the US has continued with the sanctions and whatnot. But one quick word on the sanctions is that the larger analysis here, the larger context is the end of US hegemony. right? And this is something that we see in many ways, like politically, diplomatic influence, the financial system is, coming under question because of all the sanctions, that have been applied unilaterally. So there's all these things happening that are basically pointing to U.S. hegemony and Western hegemony really being in decline in the face of emerging powers, from outside of the West, like China, Russia, Brazil, India, the BRICS countries. And so what we're seeing basically is that the U.S. is doing whatever it can to hold on to this hegemony, to hold on to this influence, and it's just not working. In the case of Nicaragua, Nicaragua has a trade surplus with the U.S. because we have been subject to sanctions for such a long time that we've had to rely on our own peasantry, our own people from the rural areas to continue production and to continue growing food. We're 97% food sovereign in Nicaragua. If you look at the basic staples, we could be 100% food sovereign. So sanctions hurt us, but they won't bring us to our knees. We won't starve because we have been able to develop our agriculture and many other sectors independently from U.S. investment and U.S. capital, industry, technology, and whatnot. And so
And that's one of the differences between Nicaragua and Venezuela, for example. Venezuela before the the Bolivarian Revolution, for example, the Venezuelan economy was so interlinked with the United States. They imported about I think over 80% of all their consumer goods were all imported from the United States from abroad. So when sanctions started hitting them, it was really hard for them because they didn't cushion, weren't able to cushion themselves. They had time to cushion themselves, right, to those sanctions, right. Whereas Nicaragua, for example, Nicaragua's been under sanctions since the late 70s. And once the Sandinista defeated the Contras, for example, the sanctions went even harder on Nicaragua, et cetera, right? The sanction wasn't lifted until the neoliberal governments came in 91, 92. But once Ortega came back to power, once the Sandinista came back to power, the sanctions started creeping up again. So you guys, like saying, you guys have been cushioned, you guys have been used to living under sanctions, and you guys were able to create an economy within to resist that sanction, whereas Venezuela didn't have that opportunity. So when sanctions hit them really hard after 2014, then increasingly under Trump in 2018, that's where you saw all those images that you saw here. How terrible Maduro is and how evil the Bolivarians and Chavistas are and everything that, but they're not taken into context as sanctions. But same with Cuba example. Cuba's also suffered sanctions, since the 1960s, since actually the revolution. They had a string, they were embedded within the rest of the socialist blocs during the Cold War. But after the Cold War ended in the 90s, right, that's when they entered a special period because they were pretty much left alone, just like North Korea. So they were left outside of the global economy, and sanctions were increasing on them as well. But they also learned how to live with it. They also learned how to go around it. They also learn how to, survive sanctions. Just like you're describing with Nicaragua.
and alongside that, going back to this declining hegemony, the bind that the U.S. is in right now is that what happens if the U.S. goes after these economies, that are highly productive and that are very independent? Like in Nicaragua, there's a lot of people-driven programs, that on tourism, for instance, or trade, local, regional, international, high levels of production, even during the pandemic, because we were able to use other tools to keep people safe. We did not stop production. So we sort of became the breadbasket, of the region. And so the bind that the U.S. is in is that with declining hegemony and in the face of these emerging powers, is that where the U.S. withdraws, another power comes in and fills the void, right? So if we stop doing trade with the U.S. because the U.S. says, this horrible dictatorship, it's not deserving of doing trade with the U.S., then China comes in and China says, well, I'll buy it from you. You have meat, you have beans, you have cheese, whatever you have, we'll buy it from you. right? And this is something that's not just true of Nicaragua, but pretty much anywhere. The U.S. is in a really difficult situation because of Chinese influence, and because there are all these other nations that, like if you look at the production and wealth being produced by the BRICS nations, and you look at the European Union, BRICS are more powerful. India is a superpower in terms of technology, military superpower. China in technology, in finance, along with Russia. Russian weapons are like years ahead of Western technologies in many cases, not all cases, obviously. But so what happens? So the situation that the U.S. is in is that if they go really harsh against a particular economy, it's almost like an invitation for the Chinese to step in and say, okay, well, we'll buy it from you. And the U.S. does not want any more Chinese influence in the continent. So we have been subject to sanctions, but a lot of those sanctions have been limited in scope. Many of them have been targeted at individuals. They've hurt us, but they're not going to bring us to our knees. And they have not gone completely out of their way to completely close off trade with Nicaragua, because again, like I said, that would invite other powers to step in, and the U.S. does not want that anymore. So I mean, I don't know. I think I've gone a lot into it. I don't know if you guys have any questions, or if you want to maybe shift gears and talk about something else. But more or less is the gist of the attempted coup.
Have a few questions about the Ortega government, Ortega administration as it exists today. In researching for this, that there's you find so many different divisions on where people sit about what's happening. The revolution, the state of it, that. I'll just name off some of the things that I noticed, and I don't expect you to answer to each of them or anything, but just kind of in creating the general idea that the recent anti-terrorism law that outlaws any dissent towards Ortega, his wife becoming vice president, the removal of term limits and public services being restricted to only his supporters. And so my real question for you, I like I said, I don't want you to have to defend any of those points, but I do wonder about the recent, or it's not recent, but recent, the last decade, the Sandinista split, that the different things that have come out of, like the open letter from Noam Chomsky and Daniel Ellsberg. And again, I don't necessarily agree with everything they said, but I do notice that there's a lot of people saying what's really happening here. Are we still is what we understand about Nicaragua and about the Sandinista movement the same as it was, and lastly, and I'll let you, talk about it, that your old man, your own dad, someone who stood with the movement for a very long time and risked his life, has had a change of heart. And I'm curious for you, is that if, what would be the criticisms that you would make of the Ortega government? Again, not that, every government does things that we don't agree with, but I think that there's some real questions here about, is the movement still wedded to the same ideas that it began with?
Yeah, definitely. Those are very very valid questions. And so let me start with the law dissent, outlawing dissent, right? So that was a law very much modeled after U.S. law. The first iteration of that law was actually passed by a neoliberal oligarchic government, the government of Violeta Barrios Chamorro. And that was the beginning of that, to basically outlaw dissent. It's not really outlawing dissent as much as it is basically banning anything that is coming from a foreign power to destabilize the country, right?
Hmm.
And so I'll give you an example of that. Picture Ron Paul. Picture Ron Paul expressing that he wants to be the president of the US and then traveling to China and giving an open interview, a press conference, basically saying that, that we've had it with the Biden dictatorship, we need sanctions on the US. I don't think anything should be off the table. I think that we should even look into a Chinese invasion of the US. And we really need to overthrow this dictator, because Biden has to go. And we need the Chinese government's help. The Communist Party needs to step in and basically, protect freedom in the US. And we need you to train people in our land. We need you to finance nonprofits. We need you to finance media. We need you to pass sanctions. We need you to isolate the US diplomatically. That's the kind of dissent that has been banned in Nicaragua, right? And so like the people who were banned from running, and many of whom are in jail, were people who did things like that, And so we asked the question because we don't really know what these people have been up to, but that's basically what this boils down to. The people who have been incarcerated were involved in highly violent tactics that led to the deaths of hundreds of Nicaraguans, during this attempted coup. And they were forgiven, via an amnesty law. And they were told, you can't engage in that anymore, but for the sake of reconciliation, we're going to let it go and we're going to pass this amnesty law. And they went back at it. The US continues to try to undermine the Nicaraguan government and the Nicaraguan revolution. And these people are open about it. Right. And so I actually believe that it's part of the strategy of the US, is to basically throw these people out into the lion's pit and make them do things that will force the government to take action and say, we're not going to tolerate this and we're going to arrest them. And then, of course, the story gets selectively reported. And they said, well, these were all political candidates that were not political candidates. They were not people who belonged to any real party. They had not been elected by anyone in any party to run. The vast majority of the people who were arrested in May, when there was an election in November of last year. So for you to be a legal opposition, basically because they said that, like he basically ran an election without opposition. That's not true. The traditional oppositions, all the parties, that had legal standing, legal status, they all pretty much ran unless, they were involved in destabilizing the country or they were involved in the commission of crimes. But these people did not have, a political platform, did not have a party. But they had not been selected by anyone as political candidates, and they had been involved in the commission of crimes and treason against Nicaragua. So if you try to understand it, from an American perspective, and you think about a U.S. politician, whether they have declared that they want to run or not, or whether they have been nominated by one of the official parties, just the fact that they will go to a foreign power, and one of these guys actually came to Nicaragua with a bag full of dollars, that's how blatant it was, that these people, the kinds of things that these people were doing, talking about a Panama option, talking about the invasion of Panama, talking about, handling President Ortega the Mussolini way, which you guys remember that he was hanged upside down, those kinds of things, right? So the political opposition in Nicaragua is very much alive. And, if they're not thriving, it's because their interests do not align with the interests of people, but they're still able to run, they get votes, they have representation in the National Assembly and all of that. So there's a lot of, there's a lot of twisting and of the information. As far as Ortega's wife being the vice president, this goes back to what we were talking about, the term limits and whatnot. Nicaragua, it's not a regular democracy because Nicaragua has been in the sights of the US since the 1850s, basically, if not before that. This is when we had the first invasion. You know, it wasn't a U.S. government invasion, but it was a U.S. government supported invasion. That we have been in the sights of the U.S. and because the traditional political establishment and the economic establishment and the institutional establishment in Nicaragua has been so incredibly racist and classist and pro-imperialist, you know, whether it's for Spain or for the United States. And the Sandinista movement, you know, beginning with Sandino in the late 1920s up until this very day, has been basically a rejection of the status quo. It has been a rejection of Western imperialism, whether Spanish or American. And the way that that has played out is that we have not been really able to live or to, you know, carry on with our business in a normal way, because we have always been in the sides of, you know, U.S. aggression, whether it's via sanctions or, you know, direct military invasions or proxy invasions or, you know, sabotage or you name it, right? And so we are not a country that's able to say, well, you know, we're going to work on a revolutionary plan, you know, where we're going to have presidents that are going to be basically, you know, working the same way that the United States worked to be able to transform the entire status quo, to be able to transform the power dynamics and to change history in the way that the Sandinista government has changed history. And because of that, Daniel Ortega has continued to run and the people have continued to believe in him. What happened in the 1990s was that after the Contra War and after the sabotage, you know, that the U.S. was found guilty at The Hague, after the sanctions and the blockade and everything like that, when the Sandinistas lost the election, everyone thought that the Sandinista movement was over, right? And you guys might remember that I said that because Somoza had disrupted that, you know, liberal conservative balance, he had been hated by everyone. And the Sandinistas were able to gather a lot of the different sectors within the population to fight against the dictatorship of the Somoza family. And that included oligarchs, and that included people from the bourgeoisie, middle-class people who are not necessarily in line with a popular revolution, but that hated Somoza so much that they had to be a part of a movement to overthrow him. And so what happened after the overthrow of Somoza is that the Sandinista government is a mixed government. We have people in power who are bourgeoisie, oligarchs, you know, we have intellectuals, we have people who are literate, we have people who are peasants, we have people who are college professors, writers, you know, priests, everything under the sun became a part of the revolution because Somoza was so hated. And so fast forward to the 1990 election, we lose. And a lot of the people who were upper middle class, and that includes my dad, you know, who was a famous musician, but all the intelligentsia in Nicaragua, you know, the bourgeois revolutionaries, the oligarch revolutionaries, those were the people who held down the international relations in Nicaragua. Those were the ambassadors, you know, those were the college educated people who became ministers, they became judges, they became, you know, they held down the solidarity movement between Nicaragua and a lot of the people who were in solidarity with Nicaragua, like Chomsky and Ellsberg and people like that. And so when there's this disruption, you know, when the Sandinistas lose the election, everybody thinks, well, it's over, you know, let's play nice with the US, let's get neoliberalized. And there is a battle within the Sandinista party between those who wanted to remain popular and those who wanted to become neoliberal. You know, like we remain nationalist, populist movement for the people, and we're going to continue fighting from the ground up. And there were the ones, you know, like the bourgeois, former Sandinista leaders and the oligarchs. Some of the wealthiest families were part of the Sandinista movement. They were, you know, part of the government. And so what happened was that they took all their political power, which was basically a lot of the deputies on the National Assembly, former ministers, former diplomats, and there was a split. And within that split, you know, a lot of the people who were the intellectuals and like all the bourgeois and like upper middle class and wealthy class, formed the Renovation Sandinista movement. My father was part of that. And the people who were working class, the people who were peasants, the people who were, workers and whatnot, the proletariat basically stayed with the Sandinista, with the Daniel Ortega faction of the Sandinista. And so that was devastating because they had so much of that institutional power. They have so much education, they have so much experience, with diplomacy and all these things. And the line of communication between the revolution and a lot of the movements of solidarity in the US and Europe was held by this class of Sandinistas that now were like jumping ship saying, that's it, we lost to the US. And so what happens, once you neoliberalize a revolutionary country, the government steps back, the government withdraws from education, from healthcare, from energy, from all of that, and it all becomes privatized. But the private sector does not want to meet the needs of the people. They want to make a profit. And so they focus on the people who are able to pay. If you can pay, you have healthcare. If you can pay, you have education. If you can pay, you have electricity. And so that leaves a huge vacuum. And who fills that vacuum? The nonprofit system. And so a lot of these people, a lot of these former, revolutionary bourgeois and oligarch Sandinistas became executive directors of nonprofits and human rights organizations and media organizations. And they were all financed by the USAID and the National Endowment for Democracy and the Soros Foundation and the Open Society Foundation and, like all the money that's behind the nonprofit industrial complex in the US and in movements, all over the world, from Hong Kong to the Ukraine to whatever, they were active in Nicaragua that entire time, right? And so what happened was that after we lost all this institutional power that went with these people who wanted to play nice with the US and become neoliberalized, at the next election, we lost to this coalition between the oligarchy and the bourgeoisie and, like the Sandinista split off. We lost in terms of our base was less than their combined base. We had about 35%, but the faction of the Sandinista that broke off from the Daniel Ortega faction did not win anything. They won like maybe 5% of the vote, while we won about 35% of the vote. So we took back all of the institutional power of the National Assembly. We won a lot of regional elections, mayors, councilmen and women. And it became clear that the popular base had remained with the Daniel Ortega faction, while the bourgeoisie and the middle class and the intelligentsia, they basically became isolated politically. They did not have any political power. They did not have any popular power. So their alliance with the rich, with the liberals, the conservatives, the bourgeoisie, the US embassy, and you can read all this shit on the WikiLeaks embassy cables, like all these alliances that were brokered by USAID operatives, working out of the embassy with the former Sandinistas. And so that's basically, what explains that split off, and that a lot of the people who were once Sandinistas and were very high profile Sandinistas, well, they were very high profile because they were well-spoken, educated, spoke several languages and whatnot. And because they came from a class that was not a popular class, it was not poor people, it was not peasants. And so the Sandinistas, were able to reclaim the power because they stuck to a popular, nationalist, people-centered agenda, while the faction of the Sandinista movement that split off went with the bourgeoisie and the US and the, neoliberal model. And so the wife of President Ortega is not like just his wife. She was someone who had been part of the insurgency, prior to the overthrow of the dictatorship. She's a well-known figure in Nicaragua. She's a very capable woman, and at one point, people had the choice to elect him and continue on with the program that the Sandinista movement and party and government had been implementing for a long time, by voting for them, or vote for the opposition, for the oligarchs, now split. And they chose to vote for the Sandinista party. So at the end of the day, it was a clear choice. It was an open election. It was highly observed and monitored. And the people voted for that type of change, and they didn't care that the vice president was married to the president. And, that's something that the way that I view it, as long as the people voted for that, that's it. That's what we have. And I support the government. I support the vice president. I support the president because the kind of transformative change that the people in Nicaragua have seen under the Daniel Ortega and Rosario Murillo government is unlike anything that has ever been seen in Nicaragua. And if you have a history of oppression, feudalist oppression, where people are not viewed as people, but they're viewed as the extension of the right of the oligarchs, and you go from that to being an actor of change and to being in a society that has been built from the ground up, the choice is very clear. You're going to vote for the Sandinistas, whether the vice president and the president are married or not. And so to me, that's really what matters. And I think that the combination between Rosario Murillo and Daniel Ortega is brilliant because he's a visionary and he's someone who has been through so much, as a guerrilla, as a commander, as a president, as somebody who was leading a movement from the ground up when everybody thought that the Sandinista movement was over, and has gone through so much that he has this command of the people and he has this command of the history and the trajectory, while she is someone who's somebody who's able to execute and to make things happen and to manage and to administer, and someone who shares a vision with Daniel Ortega and the militancy. And so, they complement each other in a way that has worked out for the Nicaraguan people, unlike anything has worked out for the Nicaraguan people in our entire history. So I support our government. I support our president and vice president. I think Giovanni has something to add.
Yeah, I was saying this is not, and it's not uncommon. It's have been uncommon in the region. It's have been uncommon in politics. I mean, if you look at in Argentina, for example, the popularity of Juan Perón, for example, was highly due to the popularity of his wife Eva Perón, who she wasn't a de jure vice president, but she was kind of a de facto vice president. She was very active in the decision making in the government of Argentina. Something similarity here in the United States, you can say the same thing about FDR. Part of the popularity of FDR, was due in large part because of the popularity of Eleanor. And although she wasn't an official in government, she was the first lady. She was highly involved in the decision making and the activity of government in the United States during that era. Another thing I want to touch in what you said about liberalism, and liberal democracy was more as deal with liberal democracy. I think you touched, you touched the head of the nail when you said about an inactive government. So the political project that's being under liberalism, that's being projected throughout the world, is that of having governments who are inactive, who step back and let the other agents, who are incentivized by profit to govern and to run the affairs of the state, right? You mentioned the neoliberal, you mentioned the nonprofit organization, but I could say, here in the United States, everything's left up to the markets, and that's the type of government that's being projected. When COVID hit, the first thing that was say, let the market take care of it. So we have, so you're promoting this inactive government. You're not promoting this government of actions, this active government. When you have active government, then that is called at least here in the United States, that is projected as authoritarianism, dictatorship, because they're active, they're involved. So what you're saying is you want, government, they're not involved in the affairs of the people, they're not taking care of people, and you just lift it up to the market, whose incentives, like I said, is profit, like you mentioned. Another thing I wanted to mention before we close off is, I mentioned Juan Perón. Juan Perón said that that real politics is international politics. Everything else is administration and management, right? Something to that affair. I want to know, what is Nicaragua's international politics, international geopolitics? Most countries in the hemisphere doesn't have an independent uh, international policy. Most countries in the hemisphere policy is extended to that of the United States, right? Whereas we know governments like Cuba, for example, for a long time has had independent politics, international policy. I want to know what is, if you know, if you can share with us, what is Nicaragua's international policy? And another thing before we close, also, you live in Miami. Miami has been the center of Latin American reaction for decades. Every time a popular government comes to power in somewhere in Latin America, you see reactionaries just flocking to Miami. From Miami, they do operations of destabilization, right? And it doesn't help that they have politicians like Debbie Schultz from the Democratic Party, like Marco Rubio from the from Republican, that parties, that play interference for them, for the this reactionary forces that congregate Miami, and and project and pretty much direct American policy, to placate to these reactionary forces, right? But live in that city, and I bet it's hard to organize in a city like that. Can you just share, how that experience? How's that like?
Yeah, definitely. Ever since the Cold War, we have declared ourselves as a non-aligned nation. And, I do believe that, as with a lot of other revolutionary movements for independence, where people have become emancipated, they have looked up to the United States, right? And initially, a lot of the countries that have become free from the oppression of another power or a dictatorship have initially, reached out to the U.S. For help and for cooperation and to basically have a friendly relationship. Cuba did that, Castro did that. I think Ho Chi Minh did that, in Vietnam, we did that. And, we remain open to working with the US as long as it's, on equal footing. We have never viewed the United States as an enemy. We've had, obviously, to fight for our sovereignty and our democracy with US governments. But we've also been blessed with a lot of internationalism coming from the US and, other parts of the West. And there is a lot of love between Nicaragua and US solidarity. In fact, Brian Wilson, who's a naturalized Nicaraguan, was honored, during the 43rd anniversary of the revolution, not that long ago, on July 19th. And Ben Linder, who's a martyr, who also a U.S. citizen who was killed by the Contras, who was a clown and an engineer, who was working on projects in Nicaragua when he was killed. He's very much a part of, the Nicaraguan psyche, in with regards to U.S. internationalism. In terms of the foreign policy, we are open to working with anyone. We still do trade with the United States, but we also do trade with China. We do trade with Russia. We have a working relationship with pretty much any nation out there that wants to do work with us. We also help in any way that we can. During the pandemic, a lot of the regional governments shut down their economies to go into quarantine and social distancing and whatnot. Like, a lot of industries were basically halted completely, and that created food shortage in the region. And Nicaragua stepped in and helped a lot of our partners who are not pro Nicaraguan revolution. Partners that are very much in alignment with U.S. policies and who had basically been installed by the U.S. Like in Guatemala and El Salvador and Honduras and whatnot. And we have continued to work with them. So we have I guess, like, the best way that you can define our foreign policy is that we are a sovereign nation, and we're always going to act in a way that is in the best interest of our country, our people, our land, our natural resources, and our independence and our freedom. And if the U.S. wants to be a partner to that, then great. We will work with the U.S. But if not, then we'll look elsewhere. We'll work with the Russians, we'll work with the Mexicans, we'll work with anybody who wants to do trade with us, we'll do trade with it. Anybody who wants to do solidarity work with us, we're open to that. Regarding the Miami atmosphere, you'd be surprised. A lot of the institutional power is in the hands of that highly reactionary exile, not only from Cuba, but also you have a lot of Venezuelans and you have Colombians, and you have a lot of people who adhere to the U.S. puppet in their countries of origin mentality, right? Like whether it's people who are now anti-Petro, or people who are anti-Chavez or anti-now Maduro, or people who think that Boric is a leftist, or people who think that Fernandez in Argentina is a leftist. We have them all here. But by and large, I think that the majority of the people who had migrated from South America and other parts of Latin America to Miami are people who are economic exiles. They're not very political. And so the struggles that I work on here are struggles that people of all walks of life, ideologically and politically are supporting. We have a housing crisis just like anywhere in the US, and we're out there advocating for housing. We have police brutality. We're out there, calling out police brutality. We have pretty much, I'm pretty sure that you guys in Portland and in Texas, you have some of the same things that are going on here. And those are the things that I'm working on here. I work on local policies and in coalitions with other organizations. I don't really do a whole lot of Latin American work in Miami. Most of that work happens on a national or international level, like what we're doing right now, or like the work that we have done in the past, on hybrid warfare, or going to conferences and things like that. But I don't really do a whole lot of Latin American activism. One, because it's not really something that I'm in a position to move people on, because here would be really difficult, to get something like that off the ground. And two, because there is so much more that has to do with people's day-to-day living. Families being kicked out, food insecurity is a huge thing here. Lack of access to healthcare, lack of access to education, disenfranchisement of returning citizens. You name it. And we have all those issues here. So my work as an activist and as a professional really are focused on that particular type of work, not so much on calling out, U.S. hybrid war in Latin America or elsewhere. But, that's work that I'm involved in, but more like on a national level, not so much here in Miami.
Thank you, Henry. If you you have anything else to add, close us out.
No, thank you so much for your time. I appreciate you being willing to wade through my questions, and Nicaragua and Latin America are still pretty new subjects for me, but it is getting easier to understand all the different layers that come in with hybrid warfare, and like NGOs and all these different areas that where information comes from. But thank you again for your time, for answering our questions and everything. Is there anything that you'd like to plug? Talk about stuff that you have upcoming, or website, Twitter, anything like that?
No, not really. I think we've covered a lot. And but I just want to say thank you for the opportunity. And if you want to keep working together, I'm willing. Just reach out anytime. Obviously, I don't mind answering tough questions. I know that there's a lot of misinformation, and a lot of times that's the only information that people have.
Yeah.
So this is part of why we do this work, because we want people to know. And I'm also willing to learn. I don't think I'm right all the time. I think that we're all subject to making mistakes and whatnot. So if you ever want to do this again, or maybe change the format to a debate or something like that, I'm willing. I'm always willing, as long as we do it in a way that leads to people questioning things. I don't want people to necessarily believe what I have to say, but And that's one of the ways that I open, my talks. Whenever I give a talk, I tell people, please don't believe anything I say. Just keep an open mind and then go do your own research, right?
Yeah,
and,
yeah.
and question what you're being fed by the mainstream, and maybe take some notes and go out there and do some fact checking.
Will you remind our audience the title of your book?
Yeah, it's Road from Ramadi, The Private Rebellion of Staff Sergeant Camilo Mejia.
And I'll make sure I include a link to that in the show notes if anybody wants to pick it up and read about your story. I've just gotten started on it, but it's already been a really good read. It's really a fascinating story and a powerful one. And last thing before we close out here, I want to make sure to mention our Telegram channel. Fortress on a Hill is now on Telegram. Please, if you use Telegram for other stuff that you follow, please come and say hi. Join our channel. Send us stuff that you think is important. And I think that'll do it for us today. Thank you so much for being here, Camilo. And to all of our listeners, we will see you all real soon. Take care. We're on Twitter
Thank you,
All right.
at Fortress
Take
on a
care,
Hill,
guys.
and also at Facebook.com at Fortress on a Hill. You can find our main blog page and our full collection of episodes at www.fortressonahill.com. iTunes, Stitcher, Google Podcasts, Patreon, Spotify. You name it, almost anywhere you listen, we're already waiting for you. And hey, we're always in the market for more Patreon supporters. Please consider becoming a patron at patreon.com. And if you're not into giving us a monthly payment, think about giving us a couple bucks on PayPal. The link is in the show notes. Skepticism is one's best armor. Never forget it. We'll see you next time.
Come on, you good people, and listen to my song. I hope you'll pay attention. I will not